Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Megan Bryan, and this is the first of 3 lectures I'm doing about the history of the vampire in folklore literature and film. So this is lecture 1, and the other 2 will be following in a few weeks. All right. So the term vampire probably conjures up 100 different images, and that's certainly part of its power. Indeed, the origin of the word vampire is a mystery. Some theorize that it comes from an Albanian term, dampir, literally meaning teeth and drink, so drinking through your teeth. But its etymology is actually unclear. It's a flexible, many-faceted creature that has been written countless ways in countless works. So where do you even begin when researching the phenomenon? Can it even be classified? Well, religious scholars certainly seem to think so, judging by the works of Montague Summers, a late 19th and early 20th century ordained clergyman, originally in the Church of England and then later converted to Catholicism. He wrote 2 books on vampires, among many other works involving witchcraft and demonology. And he defines the vampire as follows. So they're up there. A demon has no body, although for purposes of his own, he may energize, assume, or seem to assume a body, but it is not his real and proper body. So the vampire is not strictly a demon, although his foul lust and horrid propensities be truly demoniacal and of hell. Neither may the vampire be called a ghost or phantom, strictly speaking, for an apparition is intangible. The vampire has a body, and it is his own body. He is neither dead nor alive, but living in death. He is an abnormality, the androgyne in the phantom world, a pariah among the fiends. And this pariah among the fiends definition really explains why the vampire is so adaptable cross-culturally, never really fitting into any neat boxes in terms of definition. But there is actual historical precedent for this belief, and the writers of the 18th and 19th centuries researched the vampire figure before incorporating it into their works. It is from these original beliefs that we can learn the origins of the vampire and how it has been interpreted throughout the centuries. In 1718, when the Habsburg Empire regained parts of Serbia and Wallachia from the Ottoman Empire, known as the Peace of Passarowitz, Austrian officials began to notice and report on the destruction of so-called vampires by local residents who would exhume and then mutilate the dead bodies of their friends and neighbors. We now commonly associate vampires with the aristocracy, largely due to Count Dracula. But their roots are in the peasant tradition, where vampires were friends, relatives, and neighbors of the common people. A public inquiry into vampires was launched by the Austrian government in 1731. The people who carried out these inquiries were learned representatives, trusted and educated pillars of the community, such as the report on Peter Plagojewicz from the imperial provisor of the Gradis district, now part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which lent the myth more credit to similarly educated outsiders. And you can see the story of Peter Plagojewicz here. He's from a village called Kisilova, which is modern-day Serbia. And people who were dying said they were on their deathbed. The above-mentioned Plagojewicz, who died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, laid himself on them, and throttled them, so they would have to give up the ghost. And this is very common for folkloric vampires, is that they don't bite you or drain you to death, they throttle you. There's a feeling of suffocation a lot of times. The other subjects were very distressed and strengthened even more in such beliefs by the fact that dead Plagojewicz's wife he came to her and demanded his shoes, and that she'd left the village and gone to another. And that's very common with the vampires as well. They attacked their family members first and then spread out through the rest of the village. And since with such people, which they call vampires, various signs are to be seen, that is, the body undecomposed, the skin, hair, beard, and nails growing. The subjects resolved unanimously to open the grave of Peter Plagojewicz and to see if such above-mentioned signs were really to be found on him. And since I could not hold such people from the resolution they had made, either with good words or with threats, I went to the village of Kisilova, taking along the Gradis Pope, and viewed the body of Peter Plagojewicz just exhumed, finding, in accordance with thorough truthfulness, the first of all, I did not detect the slightest odor that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and the body, except for the nose, which was somewhat fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and beard, even the nails, which the old ones had fallen away, had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new fresh one had emerged under it. The face, hands, and feet, and the whole body were so constituted they could not have been more complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which, according to the common observation, he had sucked from the people killed by him. With great speed, they took a sharpened stake in order to pierce the corpse of the deceased and put this at his heart, whereupon, as he was pierced, not only did much blood completely fresh flow also through his ears and mouth, but still other wild signs took place. Finally, according to their usual practice, they burned the often mentioned body to ashes, and I love this ending here, of which I informed the most laudable administration, and at the same time would like to request obediently and humbly that if a mistake was made in this matter, such as to be attributed not to me, but to the rabble who were beside themselves with fear. So I love that I wasn't scared, but the peasants were. And if there's a mistake, it's totally their fault, not mine. I think that's wonderful. Bureaucrats clearly never change. But you can see here a lot of what's going to be known as the typical traditional vampire. He's a peasant. There's an epidemic of illness in the village that leads to the creation of the vampire, strangles the victim as well as draining the blood, so you get the suffocation feeling, and then the body's undecomposed with fresh skin growing. And you get rid of it by staking. Then, of course, the blood flows out of the body. So that's from a 1728 account. And this is the shoemaker of Breslau, and you can see that it contains similar attributes to the account of Peter Pogojewicz, except this one, he's a well-off peasant, but he's still a peasant. He's not aristocratic, he's rich. And he commits suicide. He cuts his throat for what reason, no one knew. And it says here, often it came to their bed, often it actually lay down with it and was like to smother people. So again, you see the suffocation. Indeed, it squeezed them so hard that not without astonishment, people could see the marks left by its fingers. And this is set in 1592. So as you can see, this is a really long, lasting belief. And it only came to light among the educated classes in the 18th century, but it actually is ancient belief, ancient practice. It says here, present were the entire council, the innkeepers, and other functionaries. In the open grave, they found the body complete and undamaged by decay, but blown up like a drum. And this is another thing that's going to be very common with the so-called vampire bodies, is that they're bloated. And the belief is that they're bloated because they've drunk everyone's blood, but it's actually a process of decay we're going to talk about in a bit. And it says here, the limbs all still hung together. They were, which is remarkable, not stiffened like those of other dead people, but you could move them. On his feet, the skin had peeled away, another had grown, much purer and stronger than the first. And as almost all sorcerers are marked in an out-of-the-way place so that one does not notice it easily, so did he have on his big toe a mole like a rose. And that's another very common thing that you're going to find is any kind of abnormality on the skin, a mole, a mark, birthmark. One of the ways people are predicted to become vampires if they're born with a cowl on a baby. But anything that can be construed as a devil's mark, so a weird mole pattern. If you know anything about the history of witchcraft, like anything can be construed as devil's mark. If you kind of squint and turn your head at a mole, you can say it looks like the devil's horns or something. But this is another sign they believed of vampirism. The wound in his throat where he committed suicide gaped open and was reddish and not changed in the slightest. And again, you take the corpse out of the grave, its head was cut off, its hand and feet dismembered, after which the back was cut open and the heart taken out, which looked as good as if it was a freshly slaughtered calf. Everything together they burned on a pyre built up of wood and of many pitch rings, and then they threw the ashes into flowing water. And so then that's how you get rid of a vampire. And that's from an account from 1868. But again, it takes place in 1591. And Breslau, of course, is modern day Poland. So again, Eastern European, as I said, well-off vampire, but not an aristocrat yet. Suicide, which will become a very, very common way of becoming a vampire, particularly in the literary tradition. Again, the strangling the victim, the suffocation feeling, the body's undecomposed with fresh skin growing. There's the mole on the toe, the devil's mark there. The corpse is bloated with blood. And then in this case, you remove the head and then you burn the heart and the body. But dismembering of any kind is usually a good way because they believe that if you physically couldn't get up, there was no way you could be a vampire. So cutting off like the head or the legs is a good way to make people not move anymore. Okay, a similar scene was witnessed by regimental medical officers in the case of Arnold Powell, and this is 1727, who claimed during his lifetime to have been troubled by a vampire. And this case is really interesting because this is one of the ones that you can, I think the text is still in Nuremberg, it still exists. And it's one of the first like really official documents that are signed off by these people. It was commissioned by local authorities and it was called Visum et Repertum, which is translated as Seen and Discovered. And this is the account that's cited by Robert Southey in his poem, The Lob of the Destroyer, which we'll talk about in a bit. And this man, Arnold Powell, was made a vampire because he encountered a vampire in Turkish Serbia. And You can see here, it says he broke his neck in a fall from a wagon. This man had during his lifetime revealed that near Gosova in Turkish Serbia, he'd been troubled by a vampire, wherefore he had eaten from the earth of the vampire's grave and had smeared himself with the vampire's blood in order to be free of the vexation he'd suffered. And that clearly doesn't work, because it says in 20 or 30 days after his death, some people complained they were bothered by this same Arnold Powell. And in fact, 4 people were killed by him. In order to end this evil, they dug up this Arnold Powell 40 days after his death. And they found that he was quite complete and undecayed, and that fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, that the shirt and the covering the coffin were completely bloody, that the old nails on his hands and feet along with the skin had fallen off, and that new ones had grown. And since they saw from this that he was a true vampire, they drove a stake through his heart according to their custom, whereby he gave an audible groan and bled copiously. Thereupon they burned the body the same day to ashes and threw these into the grave. These same people say further that all those who were tormented and killed by the vampires must themselves become vampires. Therefore, they disinterred the above-mentioned 4 people in the same way. Then they also add that this Arnold Powell attacked not only the people, but also the cattle and sucked out their blood. And since the people use the flesh of such cattle, it appears that some vampires are again present here, because if you died after you then become a vampire as well. It says here, this woman, Stanaka, started up out of her sleep with a terrible cry, fearful and trembling, and complained that she had been throttled by the son of a Hajduk, a soldier by the name of Milo, who had died 9 weeks earlier, whereupon she'd experienced a great pain in her chest and become worse hour after hour until she finally died on the 3rd day. So again, this kind of pain in the chest, suffocation feeling. If anyone's familiar with like the sleep paralysis, now it's obviously it's diagnosed as sleep paralysis, but before there would be a belief in a creature known as the hag, which was meant to be this old woman who would climb up and throttle you. So vampires are sort of a similar idea to that in the folklore. And again, we have the same thing. He thinks the blood of the vampire would protect him. It doesn't in this case. Body undecayed, fresh blood in the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, new skin grown. And here you really have the stake through the heart and the body burned. And then again, the people attacked by the vampire, they die and then pass on the condition. And that's going to be, because this, as I said, this account was cited by Robert Southey. So this is one of the ones that comes to England if people look up what a vampire is. And so a lot of these things that you're going to see, like the stake through the heart, and the being attacked by a vampire and becoming a vampire, that becomes so common in the modern belief in vampires, it really originates with this account. So it's very important. And these are the people that Arnold Powell attacked, or that ate the cattle that he attacked. And again, similar things. This first woman, Stana, they dug her up and she was complete and undecayed. After opening the body, they found that there was fresh blood everywhere in her body. The skin on her hands and feet, along with the old nails, fell away. And then you've got new nails there. And then number 2, there's a woman called Melisa. And she died after the vampire attack there. In her chest, she had much blood. And this is, again, they say that she was quite thin in life, but at the moment when they dissect her, she's very plump. And again, the theory is that this is because she's been drinking the blood that's bloated her. In Dracula, after he's drunk blood, Harker describes him as being bloated like a filthy leech, and that's this image very much here. And then number 6, you have a woman named Rusha, who died after telling illness, and which there was blood, and then there was much fresh blood also in her child. So again, it's not exclusive to one gender or indeed one age. It's anyone can be a vampire here. Number 7 is a girl 10 years of age who had found the above mentioned condition quite complete and undecayed and had much fresh blood in her chest. And then you have number 11 is Stanchi, a Hajduk soldier who died 6 weeks previously. I noticed a profuse liquid blood like the others in the chest and stomach. The entire body was in the oft-named condition of vampirism. And then lastly, you have Stanoka, the wife of a soldier, 20 years old. She died after a long illness. And it says here she's quite red and quite vivid. She had been throttled by at midnight by Milo, the son of the Hajduk, same as that first woman. And there was also to be seen on the right side under the ear a bloodshot blue mark the length of a finger. And again, this is this kind of devil's mark idea. Anything out of the ordinary means that she's a demon. It says here, fresh bleeding, all the viscera were good, fresh nails on the hand and feet. After the examination had taken place, the heads of the vampires were cut off by the local gypsies and then burned along with the bodies, and then the ashes were thrown into the river. And again, the people who've signed this is the regimental medical officer of the foot regiment, and then lieutenant colonel. So these aren't people who are just randomers. These are people who are trusted to report the truth. But you do find that not everyone was credulous toward the vampire myth. And this is an account of a Rhocolicos, which is a Greek vampire, by a man called Piton de Tonnefourt, who was a French botanist of the 18th century. And this particular account can be mentioned in a poem by Lord Byron called The Giaour, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But he wrote here of his contempt at the hysteria over a Greek vampire. And this is from 1717. And he dismisses what people call vampire as a mass delusion. Says here, the one of whom I shall give an account was a peasant of Mykonos. And this is a guy who's naturally sullen and quarrelsome. And he's been murdered, killed in the fields. No one knew by whom or how. And then 2 days after being buried in a chapel, he was seen walking during the night, taking long strides, came into houses and turned over furniture, extinguished lamps, and played 1,000 little roguish tricks. And at first people laughed, but then even the popes acknowledged that, and then they had to look into it. So you have, interestingly, here the vampire is really more of like a poltergeist spirit. He doesn't drink any blood. He just causes trouble. But it is interesting that he has this disagreeable temperament he's described as having, and also he's a victim of murder. And you see that a lot, like sudden violent deaths, suicides, murders. These are people who are going to become vampires. It says here they took the body out and they tore out its heart. And the butcher had to like root around in the body to find the heart, but that doesn't seem to work because several of the bystanders claim that the blood of this unfortunate man was red, and the butcher says that the body was still warm. And so they say, well, he's not quite dead. He's sort of living dead, letting himself be reanimated by the devil, for that is exactly the idea they have of a Rhocolicos. And then once you've said that, this becomes a sort of mass hysteria movement. And it's interesting that de Tonnefourt particularly cites this idea that it's a spirit possessed by the devil. Because again, you have this explicitly religious context to this creature that you really can't divorce from it. But then it says, after all our reasoning, they were of a mind to go to the seashore and burn the heart of the deceased. And that didn't work. And so you can see de Tonnefourt's kind of sarcastic about it, he broke in windows, tore up clothes, and emptied pitchers and bottles. He was a very thirsty, dead man. He doesn't really believe any of this. And it says, those who believed in their soul that we doubted the truth of this matter came to us to reproach us for incredulity and claimed to prove by authoritative passages taken from the Shield of Faith of Pierre Richard, a Jesuit missionary, that there was such a thing as a Rhocolicos. He was a Latin, they said, and therefore you should believe him. And so they think that the reason the vampire is still haunting people is because they didn't do it right. The most essential part of the ceremony had been deficient. The mass should not have been said, according to them, until after the heart of this unfortunate man had been torn out. And they said with this precaution, the devil could not have failed to have been surprised, and that without a doubt he would not have returned. But because they started with the mass, he had all the time necessary to flee and come back afterwards at his convenience. And so they don't have any idea what to do. They take some holy water and they sprinkle it on the doors, and then they put it in the mouth of the vampire. And this next passage I think is particularly interesting here. It says, one day as they recited certain prayers, after having planted I don't know how many naked swords in the grave of the corpse, which they disinterred 3 or 4 times a day, an Albanian who happened to find himself in Mykonos took it upon himself to say in a professorial tone that it was extremely ridiculous to use the swords of Christians in such a case as this. Can you not see, you poor blind people, he said, that the guard of these swords forming a cross with the handle prevents the devil from leaving the corpse? Instead, why don't you use a Turkish saber? And that's interesting again, because this man's from Albania, Eastern Europe. And he has this idea that you shouldn't, this crystal symbology is actually keeping the devil in, and in order to release it, you have to use what he would consider the weapon of the pagan, the Ottoman Turk. And there's going to be this connection between the conflict between Christianity and the Muslim empire of the Ottoman Turks, and that's really where the vampire is from. It's very fertile ground, this confluence of religions here. And we'll learn more about that later. And so after that, they decided to burn up the body entirely. It says here, in the whole archipelago, people are persuaded that it is only the Greeks of the Orthodox Church whose corpses are reanimated by the devil. The inhabitants of the island of Santorini are terribly afraid of such types of werewolves, and the people of Mykonos, after their visions had dissipated, were equally afraid of prosecution by the Turks and by the Bishop of Tynos. And you can see here both Greece and indeed Eastern Europe are places where there was this battle between Christianity and Islam. The Ottoman Turks and the Christian empires of Europe fought constantly in these realms. So it's this sort of unstable location. And it says here, as for the Turks, it's certain that at their first visit, they did not fail to make the community of Mykonos pay for the blood of this poor devil, who became in every way an abomination and horror to his country. And after that, it is not necessary to point out that the Greeks of today are not the great Greeks, and that there is among them only ignorance and superstition. So that's the tone of her, kind of harsh, but there we are, and that's from 1717. So really, the vampire myth is an attempt by pre-scientific cultures to make sense of observed connections between death, burial, and decay. It's a supernatural belief with roots in the scientific process of observation, inquiry, and conclusion. Vampires are traditionally harbingers of plagues, wars, and famine, as we've seen. When a mysterious illness would occur, the assumption would be that it was the fault of the vampire. You can see here, suspected after mass death in the village, association with plagues, attacks the family first and then spreads to the rest of the village. We've talked about coming at night to smother or throttle the sleeper in bed. You have these no signs of decay, hair and nails have grown, supple limbs and fresh skin, sometimes the devil's mark, blood on the mouth or bloated corpse, hence the belief that they drank blood. And often suicides are those who had died violently or engaged in immoral behaviors. And also anyone born with any physical abnormalities, similar to the devil's mark idea. And the vampire is really a creature that originates in the eastern regions, Eastern Europe and the Levant. And these regions have a history of conflict and instability. So it's a very violent creature of a very violent origin. And you have here, this is Dom Calmet in 1746, and he wrote a book about vampires, which we're going to talk about in a bit. And he says, thanks be to God, we are by no means credulous. We avow that all the light which science can throw on this fact discovers none of the causes of it. Nevertheless, we cannot refuse to believe that to be true, which is juridically attested and by persons of probity. So we don't want to be simpletons who believe in everything, but this belief has been written down and attested to by doctors and soldiers and people who are serious. So we're going to trust the experts and follow the science. And that seems fair enough. So I've mentioned the Eastern European nations where the vampire superstition was most prevalent, such as Romania and Bulgaria, were subjected to repeated invasion attempts by the Ottoman Turks over the centuries. And the historical Dracula, Vlad III of Wallachia, spent most of his reign battling the Ottoman Empire during the 15th century, and there'll be more on him later. So as I've said, the region with which the vampire is widely associated in this period is one of constant violence and conflict and constant fluctuating and unstable national identities. And so once you've identified a vampire, what do you do next? And as we've seen, there are many ways to rid yourself of them, and not all of them work, apparently. And so these here are a few tried and true tested methods. Head cutting off, dismembered body, heart removed and burn. Good old-fashioned stake through the heart, usually in conjunction with beheading or burning. And then you can also fill the mouth with garlic, an effective deterrent. And that's actually a very scientific discovery that they made, because there's been tests now that if you eat a lot of garlic, your blood thins out and tastes funny, and so you're not as bothered by mosquitoes. And so they noticed that with these insect blood drinkers and thought, well, that'll work for human blood drinkers. Why wouldn't it? So that's very smart. And you see on the right there's a 13th century grave of a vampire discovered in Bulgaria in 2014. He's got the iron rod through the chest there, and the left leg was removed and placed beside the corpse. And that's what I've talked about with the dismemberment, this idea that if you like cut off the leg or the head, it can't get up. And so it's a very practical way, of thinking about it. We think of these sort of supernatural things as almost having no restrictions, but these people weren't stupid, and they were actually very practical people. And they said, well, if you just cut off the leg, then it physically can't get up. So it's a good solution to that problem there. And the iron stake is important. Of course, iron's a very good metal against anything demonic, because it's the metal that nailed Jesus to the cross. So iron's very good. Or also hawthorn wood, because if you're going to use a wooden stake, because that's the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. And so, again, these Christian symbols are very powerful against what is believed to be a demonic creature. And this vampire here on the left, 17th century grave, was discovered a few weeks ago on the 6th of September, 2022, and she has a sickle around her neck. So if she gets up, her head gets cut off. So she can't get up. And again, very practical, very, I think, very smart way of dealing with these creatures if you sincerely believe in them. So the vampire craze in the 18th century was really an early media event in which educated Europeans became aware of practices that were by no means of recent origin, as you can see, but had simply been provided for the first time with effective public relations representatives. And the vampire craze spread quickly from Austria and Eastern Europe to other parts of Europe. In 1746, French biblical scholar Augustin Calmet, that's the guy on the previous slide, anthologized the written material pertaining to vampire sightings and exhumations, and is precisely titled, and I'm going to mess this up because I don't speak French, so I'm sorry. Dissertation sur les apparitions des anges, des démons et des esprits, et sur les rêves et vampires de Hongre, de Beaume, de Moravie, et de Cilicie. So that's roughly translated as dissertations on the apparitions of angels, demons, and the spirits, and the revenants of vampires in Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. And this work was passed around among late 18th century scholars, but was virtually inaccessible beyond the educated classes due to its exclusive publication in French. From the European continent, then, the belief spread to Britain. According to the writer Horace Walpole, even King George II believed implicitly in vampires. And while Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and Matthew Lewis, among others, fed the public's appetite for tales of the Gothic and the supernatural in the late 18th century, the vampire in English remained largely absent in prose, but in poetry, however, it was another story. So as I said, these previously mentioned reports of vampirism were cited in the works of popular Romantic poets, including Robert Southey's The Lob of the Destroyer in 1801, where he footnotes the account of Arnold Powell discussed previously. And Lord Byron here cites de Tonifert as honest Tonifert in his footnote to the Giaour in 1813. And Byron attests that, quote, the freshness of the face and the wetness of the lip with blood are the never-failing signs of a vampire, which he drew from both Tonifert and Southey's accounts of the superstition. Giaour, which is the title of the poem, is an offensive Turkish word for an infidel or non-believer. And the poem is actually subtitled A Fragment of a Turkish Tale, and is Byron's only fragmentary narrative poem. Byron designed the story with three narrators giving their individual points of view about the series of events. The main story of the Giaour is that of Layla, a member of her master Hassan's harem, and she loves the Giaour and is killed by being drowned in the sea by Hassan. And in revenge, the Giaour kills Hassan and then enters a monastery due to his remorse. Byron's poem focuses on a broadly Eastern domain. Again, the Giaour in the poem is cursed to become a vampire by the mother of the Turkish antagonist, and hence the Giaour is the victim of a foreign curse by a foreign character. And Byron describes the vampire in the poem with similar traits to those discussed in previous incarnations of the figure. And you can see here, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. Therefrom thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living corse. Thy victims, ere they yet expire, shall know the demon for thy sire. As cursing thee, thou cursing them, thy flowers are withered on the stem. So you've got this again, destroying its family first, cutting off its own bloodline. It's very common for early vampires. And it starts by destroying its own family first until its bloodline has been completely destroyed. Now, Lord Byron was an early, and many claim one of the first celebrities, which can loosely be defined as a person with a prominent personal life who exists in a three-way, almost vampiric relationship between himself, his audience, and his publishers. Although now with the rise of social media, it's really more just himself and his audience. The middleman of the publisher is cut out. So there's more direct mutual vampirism there. Now, Lord Byron was the subject of intense media speculation during his lifetime, thanks to his scandalous personal life. And in 1816, he was forced to flee England due to rumors of sexual impropriety, including incest with his half-sister, and even more scandalous at the time, marital sodomy, a rumor which affected him deeply since sodomy was in fact illegal at the time in Britain. According to his friend John Cam Hobhouse, quote, he became dreadfully agitated, saying he was ruined and threatening to blow out his brains. By the spring of 1816, Byron's reputation was summed up as follows by his friend Mary Godfrey. By the spring of 1816, Byron's reputation was summed up as follows by his friend Mary Godfrey, quote, "The world are loud against him and vote him a worthless profligate. He is completely lost in the opinion of the world, and I fear he is the sort of character never to make an effort to recover it. So I look on him as given up to every worthless excess for the rest of his life." He left England in 1816, as I said, in the company of a physician called John Polidori, who would become responsible for making Byron and vampirism completely inseparable. John William Polidori was not a famous figure in his day, certainly not compared to Byron. Polidori is described by his own nephew, William Michael Rossetti, who posthumously edited his diary as, quote, "overweening and petulant, too fond of putting himself forward face to face with those two heroes of our poetical literature, Byron and Shelley, and too touchy when either of them declined to take him at his own estimation. I will allow that this judgment of Polidori is, so far as it goes, substantially just, and that some of the recorded anecdotes of him prove him deficient in self-knowledge, lacking prudence and reserve, and ignoring the distinction between a dignified and a quarrelsome attitude of mind. So with family like that, who needs enemies? When his travels with Lord Byron began, Polidori was freshly graduated from Edinburgh University, earning his full degree in medicine in 1815 at the age of 19, which is a remarkable achievement. He wrote his medical thesis on somnambulism, or sleepwalking, which will become a common trope in later vampire stories. Now, Polidori attended Edinburgh from 1810 to 1815, nearly 15 years before the infamous Burke and Hare murders in 1828, when the need for human bodies for the study of anatomy led to murder, and the subsequent Anatomy Act of 1832. The role of corpses in the scientific study of galvanism was established before Polidori arrived in Edinburgh, however. Now, galvanism was the belief that electric shocks could revive a body to life, which was popularized in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This effect was demonstrated when Giovanni Aldini experimented on the corpse of an executed prisoner at Newgate in 1803. And he describes the effect in this detail, quote, "Electrical charges caused one eye to open, the legs to jolt, and the hand to raise itself as in greeting." Now, referring back to the questions of sleepwalking that fascinated Polidori, this experiment provided visual proof that the body could operate independently of the mind. So even when someone is dead, someone else can operate the body. And it also proved that another being could indeed control the actions of the body, whether that body were living or dead. And that's, vampirism 101. Such public spectacles resulted in a popular conflation between resurrection men and surgeon anatomists, between criminality and anatomy, and between brutality and dissection. It is this conflation that the literature of this period taps into, particularly in Frankenstein, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But the forced involuntary control of one being over another is a trope that will continue throughout vampire literature, as we'll see. Now, since Lord Byron was already making plans to absent himself from England, and since his health, affected by the allegations against him, had not particularly improved, it seemed natural that he would take a physician to accompany him on his travels. But the choice of Polidori, however, was subject to much debate from both sides, due to the poet's infamy and Polidori's relative inexperience. But on the morning of the 23rd of April, 1816, Byron and Polidori and several friends left Byron's London home early for Dover. And they had to leave early because Byron was greatly in debt, and the moment after he left, bailiffs entered his home and seized everything he left behind. Now, on their travels throughout Europe, Polidori and Byron started out friendly enough, but their relationship grew strained during their travels through Germany. One reason for this was that Polidori was completely useless to Byron as a doctor, since Byron's physical health appeared to be completely restored by his travel abroad. The one time Polidori did exert his medical skill to heal a blacksmith in Ghent, Byron wrote to his friend Hobhouse, joking, "I dare say he is dead by now," the first in a long series of jokes about Polidori's medical skills or lack thereof. In late May of 1816, Lord Byron and John Polidori met up at the Villa Diodati in Switzerland with the poet Percy Shelley and his future wife Mary Godwin, referred to as Mrs. Shelley by both Polidori and Byron, although the Shelleys were not married at the time. And Percy Shelley had in fact abandoned his wife Harriet Westbrook, who later committed suicide by drowning herself in the Serpentine at the age of 21. The party at the villa also included Mary's sister, Claire Claremont, Byron's former lover and pregnant with his child. She was resentful of Polidori and saw him as a roadblock to resuming her affair with Byron. Now, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron became fast friends, according to Daisy Hay. Quote, on the surface, it was an unlikely pairing. Byron, at 28, was jaundiced and embittered about being hounded out of England, in contrast to the idealistic, enthusiastic 23-year-old Shelley, but each recognized and respected the other's talent. They both looked down on Polidori, however, who had literary ambitions, but according to them, no talent. Polidori was younger than both of them at 20 years old, and indeed wrote in his diary entry for June 18th that Mary Shelley, quote, called me her brother, younger. Now, Mary Shelley was only 18 at the time, but apparently appeared more worldly than Polidori. In fact, Mary Shelley was the only member of the party who seems to have been friendly to Polidori, although by the end of the summer, he alienated her as well as the others. Her later references to him are as disdainful and inaccurate as theirs. She refers to him as poor Polidori in her introduction to Frankenstein, and one suspects poor Polidori in this case is more of a patronizing name than a sympathetic one. It's clear that Mary Shelley's opinion of him never improved. The story that Mary Shelley famously recounted in the 1831 introduction to Frankenstein is that on literally a dark and stormy night, Lord Byron proposed that they all write a ghost story, and Mary supposedly had a dream that night of a man working on corpses in a laboratory, and one of the corpses coming to life, which inspired her most famous novel, Frankenstein, while Polidori began to write his own tale about a vampire. And you can see here she talks about some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was so punished for peeping through a keyhole. And we don't know what that is. We don't think that story ever existed. She might have been misremembering or misattributing it to someone else, because that's not what Polidori wrote as a result of the contest. Published in 1819 and appropriately titled The Vampire, Polidori's book became an instant success because of its association with Byron. The manuscript was sent to Lord Byron's publishers anonymously, and the first publication on April 1st, 1819 was subtitled A Tale by Lord Byron, as you can see there. Now, it's unclear how the periodical which published it, Henry Colburn's New Monthly Magazine, had got hold of the manuscript, since Polidori had left it behind at Geneva in 1816 and had almost completely forgotten about it. Polidori wrote a letter to Henry Colburn the day after its publication, claiming the work as his, but describing it, quote, as imperfect and unfinished. Nevertheless, the attachment of Byron's name made the book instantly popular, as Colburn knew it would, which is why he credited its authorship to him and neglected to correct it. And you have here, this is John Polidori and the introduction to Ernestus Berchtold of the Modern Oedipus. And he explains this, the tale which lately appeared and to which his lordship's name was wrongfully attached was founded upon the groundwork upon which this fragment was to have been continued. Two friends, and this is basically the plot of The Vampire, by the way, two friends were to travel from England into Greece. While there, one of them should die, but before his death should obtain from his friend an oath of secrecy with regard to his decease. Some short time after, the remaining traveler returning to his native country should be startled at perceiving his former companion moving about in society, and should be horrified at finding that he made love to his former friend's sister. Upon this foundation, I built The Vampire at the request of a lady who denied the possibility of such a groundwork forming the outline of a tale which should bear the slightest appearance of probability. In the course of 3 mornings, I produced that tale and left it with her. From thence it appears to have fallen into the hands of some person who sent it to the editor in such a way as to leave it so doubtful from his words whether it was his lordship's or not, that I have found some difficulty in vindicating it to myself. And it's interesting here that Polidori kind of blames a lady for it. It was either Mary Shelley or Claire Claremont, according to him, who suggested it and who he left it with. So he kind of apportions the blame to one of them. It's interesting that we don't actually ever know who sent it to him. We probably won't ever know. And you have here John Cam Hobhouse, in his continuing contempt of Polidori, wrote the following letter to Byron, notifying him of the publication of the story. Quote, a cursed and trashy tale entitled The Vampire was lately advertised in your name. I recollected your telling me something about a picnic of that kind at Diodati, so I thought it possible that Dolly, that's Polidori, it's his contemptuous nickname for him there, might have purloined your tale and was now covering his nakedness with it. The moment, however, I saw this vampire, I, who know your style, swore the whole to be a vile imposture and Dolly's whole and sole doing. Now, however, he publishes a letter in the paper saying that though the vampire in its present form is not yours, yet the groundwork is certainly yours. To this he has put his damned Italian polysyllabic name. I think it would be advisable for you to send to Murray a note to be published in the papers, totally depriving the doctor of any copyright in groundwork, or he will continue making use of your name. I fear he is a sad scamp, but I told you that you were wrong in taking him. I did. So that's nice. Lord Byron disowned the book completely. He confessed to his friend Thomas Medwin, quote, "I was forced to disown the publication lest the world should suppose that I had vanity enough or was egotist enough to write in that ridiculous manner about myself." And I don't know if this is a joke, because often Byron did write in a ridiculous manner about himself. Most of his poems are about himself in one way or another. So I don't know why this particular thing would be unusual. I guess it's a prose work, not poetry. So that might be it. But it's also highly probable that Byron's purported disdain for the vampire has more to do with its author and less to do with its subject. By the time the story was published, Byron and Polidori were no longer on friendly terms. The break between them seems to have come from a series of slight quarrels, which gradually became worse and worse. Indeed, Polidori's own account of the affair to his father admits that there is no glaring reason for the break with Byron. He says, "We have parted, finding that our tempers did not agree. He proposed it, and it was settled. There was no immediate cause, but a continued series of slight quarrels. I believe the fault, if any, has been on my part. I am not accustomed to have a master, and therefore my conduct was not free and easy." Now, what is noteworthy, however, is an account of Polidori's reaction after a disagreement with Byron when Polidori's dismissal seemed inevitable in Europe. And it says here, "He looked on this as nothing less than ruin and went to his room to poison himself. He was just wondering whether to leave a note when Byron himself tapped the door and entered with his hand held forth in sign of reconciliation. Polidori burst into tears." Now, attempted suicide over a slight quarrel with your employer is evidence of a melancholic and depressive temperament. And indeed, 5 years later, in 1821, Polidori's next suicide attempt with prussic acid would be successful. Now, as discussed previously in The Shoemaker of Breslau, one of the traditional methods in folklore for becoming a vampire is death by suicide. And this is probably because it's the worst sin you can commit in the Catholic Church, that you can't absolve yourself if you kill yourself because you can't have your last rites. So it's the most damned of all the damned sins there. And as will be detailed in the next chapter, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but it's morbidly tragic that the first vampire author in the English language committed suicide. And while the vampire should have secured his legacy in literature, even today, credit's often given to Byron's association with the vampire, while Polidori is frequently left out of the conversation altogether. There's only 2 books, I think, on Polidori's life. I've only found one biography when I was doing my research. There's really not much written about him. People seem to overlook him whenever they do that Villa Diodati story. They usually mention Byron and the Shelleys. He's been completely sort of cut out of the history of this tale that he wrote, which is very sad. But the vampire figure often overshadows its creators. Polidori is not a well-known writer any more than Bram Stoker is, and there's very little academic scholarship on Polidori, as I said. Both are known, if they are known at all, for creating a famous vampire or for working for a celebrity. Polidori, of course, worked for Lord Byron, and Stoker worked for Henry Irving, who was regarded as the greatest actor of the late Victorian era. So Mary Shelley's label, Poor Polidori, appears to have been slightly prophetic on her part. Now, Lord Byron would meet his own death 3 years after Polidori in 1824, fighting for Greek independence. Byron had been a long admirer of Greece and is still considered a hero to that country for his sacrifice. And you have this Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1824, stanzas on the death of Lord Byron. That generous heart whose genius thrilled divine has spent its last most glorious throb for thee, then sank amidst the storm that made thy children free. So he's got this wonderful martyrdom death, as someone who died in the cause of freedom. And Byron's love for Greece probably has to do with him viewing the East as the site or birthplace of Europe's great cultural heritage, while at the same time viewing the East as a site into which one could escape from modernity and Europe itself. And you can see when he flees to England, he goes to Greece. Greece at the time, in 1824, was contested by forces of rival faiths vying for control: Ottoman Turkish Muslims and Greek Eastern Orthodox Christians. As stated previously in the discussion of the Giaour, and indeed in the folklore vampires, this religious and cultural conflict is a common trope of both traditional vampires and their later incarnations. And the fact that both Byron and Southey reference Greek vampires in the footnotes to their poetry demonstrates that the superstition was associated with that country at the time, rather than the more modern associations of the vampire with Eastern Europe, largely due to Dracula being a native of Transylvania. But as I've said, what both Greece and Transylvania have in common, however, is the conflict of cultures and religions, which makes up both their respective histories, and thus influences the vampire as well, since it's a creature of the origin of those countries. This foreign setting is especially prominent in the context of vampire literature, since the journey to the East in both the vampire and later in Dracula is almost a literal journey to the past, where myths and superstition still hold sway over a credulous population, and the past is literally another country. And the Eastern setting, as I've said, is also the origin of these creatures of myth and superstition, and the point from which they can be brought into the West for good or ill. And of course, it's usually ill in a vampire's case. And now, the popular association between Byron and the vampire endured after his death, and for the next few decades, many unauthorized sequels and adaptations of the character of Lord Ruthven, who is the vampire, they call him Lord Byron, who is the vampire of the story, Lord Ruthven, appeared in print and on stage. A few years after the publication of The Vampire, several plays were written in French by Charles Nodier. One, a stage adaptation of the novel, and another written in 1820 is a sequel to the story featuring Lord Ruthven, the vampire. Several years later, in 1828, two German operas were written and produced based on Polidori's tale, both titled Der Vampir. Although to distinguish one from the other, one version, the vampire is called Aubrey rather than Ruthven, and Aubrey is the name of Ruthven's companion in The Vampire, which we'll get to in a bit. And even into the mid-19th century, Ruthven's popularity endured. Elsewhere in Europe, the Swedish author Victor Rydberg wrote a novel called Vampiren in 1848, featuring a character called Lord Ruthven, not a vampire, but rather a lunatic who believes himself to be a vampire. And that's a theme, the madness vampire connection is going to be revisited later by Bram Stoker in Dracula. And Byron really was, more than any other author of his time, the focus of countless attempts at what would now be called fan fiction, that is, imaginative stories written by amateur writers about Byron and his works. I'm not sure I'd call some of these writers amateur, but there was certainly a need to emulate both Byron as a person and in his works there. Alexander Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers, published a sequel to The Vampire in 1865, translated as The Return of Lord Ruthven. And his novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, features a countess who refers to Edmond Dantes as Lord Ruthven and attributes the creation of that character to Lord Byron, indicating how persistent that misattribution turned out to be. Lord Ruthven's presence spread all over Europe, resulting in diverse efforts to carry on the literary trope of the aristocratic vampire and the Byronic anti-hero. Even the popular perception of Byron turned slightly vampiric. According to Christopher Frayling, in Paris at the time of the novel's publication, quote, Boulevard gossips were unwittingly contributing to the sales of the book by spreading the rumor that Byron had murdered his mistress and enjoyed drinking her blood from a cup made of her cranium. Now, that summary that Polidori gave of the premise on which he laid the foundation for The Vampire is basically accurate. These two gentlemen meet. Aubrey is the narrator and Lord Ruthven's the vampire. And they go all over Europe before Aubrey becomes disgusted with his friend, who, while he's in England, the vampire is this kind of quiet, staid, repressed character. But then the moment he gets onto the European continent, he indulges in all these vices, gambling, womanizing. And they meet this peasant girl called Ianthe, who we'll talk about later, and she becomes the victim of the vampire. He murders her by draining her of blood. And then later on, he's attacked by some bandits and is murdered himself. And he tells Aubrey that you have to swear not to speak of my death to anyone. And Aubrey, of course, swears this. And then he returns to England and finds that Lord Ruthven is alive again and is courting his sister. In fact, she's going to be married to him. And rather than telling her this, he has to keep to his vow, which is that I promise not to say anything. And so he doesn't. And this drives him mad, basically, that he can't say anything. And his sister's going to be a victim. And eventually he dies by a blood vein, I think, bursting in his temple. And then the end of the story is that the sister is victimized by the vampire and killed. So it's not very happy, but it is the template for all this. And so you can see here, the Vampire describes its title character, Lord Ruthven, with few of the attributes that the word vampire might conjure up to a modern reader, except for his being pale. It says here his notable characteristics were the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion, though its form and outline were beautiful. So he's, again, very aloof, aristocratic seducer, and very attractive. But although attractive, he retains the outsider quality of the vampire. It says here he gazed upon the mirth around him as if he could not participate therein. Now, just as Byron was, Ruthven is intriguing for his eccentricity and notoriety. His aloofness attracts attention and labels him as a social outcast, not in the sense that society rejects him, but in that he becomes an object for people to stare at and speculate about because of his peculiar oddity. It says here his peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house, all wished to see him. Now, he's less of a celebrity and more of a spectacle, someone to be interacted with, not to be interacted with, but more to be looked at, sort of like a freak show. But the appeal of Ruthven to the people of London society is not only his eccentricity, but also his attractiveness and, of course, his nobility. Ruthven is the first, he's Lord Ruthven. We don't know if it's a genuine title or merely a pretense, and it doesn't really matter. Because he's the first aristocratic vampire. And from that moment, most vampires are going to be aristocratic. The name Ruthven has also appeared in an 1816 novel by Lady Caroline Lamb, who was Byron's former mistress. And her character's name was Clarence de Ruthven, Lord Glenarvan. And that was meant to be a caricature of Lord Byron. So again, these associations are intentional on the part of Polidori. And as I said, prior to 1819, vampires were usually of the peasantry, as you've seen, and not particularly attractive. But afterwards, they're nearly exclusively of the nobility, and very attractive. And again, the reading public's obsession with Byron is a huge influence here. But of course, the aristocracy also makes a good fit for a vampire. It doesn't take Karl Marx to see the metaphorical implications of a creature who literally drains the life from the working classes. And of course, if the vampire has this power of nobility, it allows them the social mobility to mix with people of all classes in order to seek out victims to satisfy its bloodlust. And there's also this mysterious aloofness and glamour associated with both the vampire and the nobility, a class with rules unto itself that the common people cannot reach. The aristocratic vampire is free to move around in high society and free from suspicion because of his rank, something which will be emulated by later literary vampires such as Count Dracula. Now, as I mentioned, the fact that Ruthven appears to eschew all vice in his appearance in London society and then immediately launches into vices of the worst kind when traveling with Aubrey presents the vampire as being deliberately deceptive, although his behavior could also be a function of geography. On the European continent, Ruthven appears as an unrestrained libertine and gambler, which he represses in London society. And again, there's parallels to Byron there, although he didn't repress much in London society either. But Ruthven must repress his passions while in England in order to blend in with his surroundings, which many vampires will in later works, notably Dracula, as I said. But once on the continent, he proves himself a violent libertine and victimizes and murders a peasant girl named Ianthe. And she's very interesting here. She's described as the innocence, youth, and beauty unaffected by crowded drawing rooms and stifling balls. Now, Lord Byron actually dedicated his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage to Ianthe when it was first published in 1812, and that name was a term of endearment he used for Lady Charlotte Harley, who was 11 years old when the poem was first published. And Ianthe was also the name of Percy Shelley's first child with his first wife, Harriet Westbrook. Now, it's telling that Polidori chooses the name, this name, Ianthe, for the victim of his Byronic vampire. Since unkind feeling developed toward both Byron and Shelley by Polidori, it's possible that the choice of that name is a jab at them both. Both female children close to these men are deprived of the presence of both men through their sexual transgressions, Shelley by abandoning his wife when he eloped with Mary, and Byron through his enforced exile because of sexual impropriety. And in the narrative, Ianthe is destroyed by Ruthven, and this is perhaps a chastisement on the part of Polidori toward Shelley and Byron, implying that their worldly lusts have made victims of their own innocent Ianthes. And you can see here, she believes firmly in this vampire creature. She deals to him the traditional appearance of these monsters, and Aubrey's horror was increased by hearing a pretty accurate description of Lord Ruthven. So house doesn't have to fall on Aubrey there. And he gets stuck in a storm, and it says here he goes to obtain shelter, and he hears the dreadful shrieks of a woman mingling with the stifled, exultant mockery of a laugh. So you have Ruthven's very sadistic creature. You know, he murders people and then sort of laughs about it. And this is going to be very similar to Dracula, but actually not similar to all vampires you're going to see in literature. It says here, again, similar traits to the vampires we talked about earlier: no color upon her cheek, upon her neck and breast were blood, and upon her throat were the marks of the teeth having opened the vein, to which the men cried, a vampire, a vampire. Now, as we've talked about, the Byronic associations with the vampire are clearly fundamental to its popularity and fairly inescapable. And they also associate the vampire with the idea of the Byronic hero. And without this association, many people contend that the vampire figure would never have risen to popularity at all. So you have this attractive, mysterious nobleman, this sort of trope of romantic fiction. And that's the reason people theorize why the vampire became so popular and still is so popular. The Byronic heroes share with the vampire a love of darkness, hypnotic eyes, and obsession with the destructive side of love, sneering smiles and quivering lips, all of which Lord Ruthven possesses and many other vampires will as well. But another reason why Ruthven's association with Byron appears so inescapable is that the vampire, as Polidori said, is based upon the fragment of a story written by Lord Byron during that ghost story contest. And this fragment was appended to his poem Mazeppa in June 1819 without Byron's knowledge or permission. He gets fairly angry about it to his publisher. But you have here the differences and similarities between them. The premise is very similar, but it has here that Ruthven in the vampire really doesn't show any emotion, but it has here, it says that he was prey to some cureless disquiet and a morbid temperament. It says here, where there is mystery, it is generally supposed that there must also be evil. I know not how this may be, but in him, the character whose name is Augustus Darval, there certainly was the one, although I could not ascertain the extent of the other. And again, Darval kind of disintegrates really at his death. He just daily more enfeebled, his habits were temperate, and he near declined nor complained of fatigue, and yet he was evidently wasting away. And that's very different to this idea of Ruthven as this strong, attacking figure. So they're actually not very similar at all. And the fragment, according to Heather MacDonald, was actually not likely intended to be a vampire story. There's nothing in this fragment that suggests the dead friend Augustus Darval was going to come back as a vampire. And the ending of the fragment, as you'll see, suggests that he won't, since his body begins to rot as soon as he dies. You have here they go to the city of the dead. So again, this is very vampiric. And he lies on this tombstone, and he says to his friend, I have no hopes nor wishes, but this: conceal my death from every human being. And that's the same vow that Ruthven makes Aubrey take, although very much wordier. And then again, he starts to rot. And so it's interesting that Byron does this kind of very simple outline, and then Polidori builds upon it to this person coming back as a vampire and terrorizing London. And as he said, it was the suggestion of a lady that would be a ridiculous story and not believable. And so he makes it believable, but really there's no indication that Byron should get any credit for that, because, I mean, there's just no indication. But as we've mentioned, Byron's association with the vampire is recognized by Polidori, first by the Ianthe thing, then by the Lord Ruthven name. And he also quotes a passage from the Giaour as an epigram in another work of his, Ernestus Berchtold. But Byron, never forgave Polidori for this describing this vampire story to him. And he wrote to Galligani's messenger after the vampire was mistakenly published under his name to correct the error and to voice his opinion on vampires. And he says, quote, I have a personal dislike to vampires, and little acquaintance I have with them would by no means induce me to divulge their secrets. But this joking vow of silence that he said to his publisher, in fact, plays a major role in both the vampire and often in later vampire fiction. The fact that the vampire is not allowed to speak and forbids others from speaking on his behalf is central to Polidori's narrative. And it's also an attribute of many popular vampire stories throughout the 19th century. And Polidori's influence is felt in all these later vampire stories. In the Penny Dreadful Varney the Vampire, which discussed in the next lecture, the title character meets a Count Polidori. And obviously the Dracula takes the aristocratic seducer to its most famous conclusion. But it all started with the baronet, Lord Byron, and a largely unknown, but hopefully now more appreciated physician called Dr. John William Polidori. And that's going to be the end of lecture 1. In lecture 2, we will go into the 19th century and all the various vampires that we find there. Thank you for listening. See you soon. Bye.